as Paige said, church history, depending on, what kind of history teachers you've had, you may think, or, like when I was in middle school, when I was in high school, I had some history teachers that were good, and I had some that were no bueno. I had some that were not very good at all.
That's Spanish.
Yeah. I had a few history teachers that they were really coaches, but they had to teach something, so they didn't teach history, and they didn't know about history or care about history, so those are not good classes. But when I got to college, and especially when I got to seminary, I had really good teachers. And so even when I took church history in seminary, and you think, oh, church history, that sounds like it'd be kind of dull. If you have a really good teacher like I did, it's not. Because church history is how do you get from the book of Acts to today? I mean, you read about the church, that we read about the church in the book of Acts, and then you look at our church and other churches today, and you say, okay, some stuff changed between the book of Acts and today. Over that 2,000-year period, stuff has changed. And so one of the things I kind of start with is one of the things that is not a part of the book of Acts is what we call denominations. Okay? And you may or may not know even what that term means. But if you do, tell me what is a Christian denomination? Anybody know what that word means? Okay. I'll give you a hint. One of them is Methodist. Okay? Methodist is a denomination. Okay? Can I spell Methodist? I should be able to after this time. Okay. So our church is a Methodist church, but there's other kinds of churches. So what would be another kind of church besides a Methodist? What?
Catholic.
Catholic, right. Or technically Roman Catholic is like the full name there. And actually we're United Methodist. Okay, so Roman Catholic would be one.
Eastern Orthodox?
Huh? Eastern Orthodox. Very good. Yeah, there's not that many of those in Oklahoma, but there are a few, and that would be, there's like subgroups of that, like Russian Orthodox or Greek Orthodox. Those are those kind of churches. Not that many in Oklahoma, though. What would be another one? Baptist. Yeah, there's a few of those around Oklahoma. A couple. There's a couple of Baptist churches. Okay. You may know, think of another one. Like
Church of Christ.
Church of Christ. That's right.
Would Scientology count?
Well, kind of yes, kind of no. Really, actually, really no. Okay, because we got Christian denominations, then we have what we would just call other religions. Okay? Religions that are not Christianity. And that would be like, what would be another religion that's not Christianity?
Judaism.
Judaism. That's right. And Scientology is not Christian. Scientology, be careful I go off on a tangent here. Scientology is a religion invented by a science fiction author named L. Ron Hubbard, who invented a whole religion about aliens and all kinds of stuff. And that's what Scientology is. And it's gonzo, weirdo stuff. Scientology has nothing to do with Christianity. But it has a lot of celebrities, and it's got Tom Cruise. It is a religion, even though it's one of the newer religions, since it was invented in the last century. Scientology. OG. And another religion that's not Christianity would be like what? Buddhism. Yeah. Buddhism. We worry a lot in the Middle East. Hinduism, like primarily in India, things like that. When you think of the Middle East, you not only think of Judaism, what's in the Middle East? Islam. Muslims. So these are all other religions. But then there's Christian denominations. And that would be like Methodist, Catholic, Orthodox, Baptist, Church of Christ, Lutheran, Presbyterian. You heard of those? Now, just to throw a curve here, there's also what's called non-denominational churches. And that's a church that's not connected. See, we're connected. We're a Methodist church, which means if you go to almost anywhere in this country, and you drive around and you see a logo, and what's our logo look like?
It's a cross with fire.
It's a cross with a flame, right? And you go around to other towns, you'll see that same logo. You'll see the cross and the flame, and I'll tell you, it's a Methodist church. Just like you're in another town and you see golden arches, and what is it? It's a McDonald's, right? And you're going to see McDonald's all over the country. I've been to McDonald's in France. I've been to McDonald's in Italy. You know, there's McDonald's all over the world. Well, there's Methodist churches all over the world. I've preached at a Methodist church in Poland. Okay, so there's Methodist churches all over the world. So those are denominations, but there's non-denominational churches, which is a church that there's just one. Like McDonald's is everywhere, but there's like a family restaurant, and it's the only restaurant. It's not a franchise. It's not everywhere. It's like just that restaurant. Well, there's churches like that. There's just that one church. There's no other ones. Like Church on the Move. Okay, Church on the Move is just in Tulsa, Oklahoma. There's only one. Now they got some satellites, but that's a non-denominational church. You know, anybody know of any other non-denominational churches? Churches that aren't part of this sort of franchise that's a denomination. I was waiting for somebody to say Life Church, because it's a trick question. Because Life Church is part of a denomination. Life Church is part of the Evangelical Covenant denomination. But they hide that. They don't tell you that. But yeah, Life Church is the same denomination as Redeemer Covenant Church. They're both Evangelical Covenant churches. But if you go to Life Church, they won't tell you that. But anyway, so you got all these different kinds of churches. And some of them are parts of denominations, and some of them are just their own thing. And then you got all these other religions, as we say, like Judaism, and Buddhism, and Islam, and even these kind of new weirdish ones like Scientology. And then you got these ones that are kind of Christian but kind of not, like Mormons. Because Mormons are kind of Christian, but they also have some kind of weird teachings that are kind of not Christian. So Mormons are kind of in a gray zone in between Christianity and not Christianity. So, and if we have time, I'll tell you more about them. But anyway. So all that to say, that didn't exist in the book of Acts. You don't have Baptist church, Methodist church, Catholic church. None of that exists in the book of Acts. It's just churches. You know, they're just churches. And Paul would go from town to town, and he'd go to Ephesus, or Corinth, or Galatia, or Thessalonica, and start a church. And then he'd write letters back to those churches he started. And that's where we have all these letters in the Bible, like Galatians and Ephesians and 1st and 2nd Thessalonians and 1st and 2nd Corinthians. Those are all letters he wrote back to churches that he planted. So there's churches in the 1st century. Okay? But early on in the 1st century, Christianity was pretty much just a Jewish thing. All the disciples were Jews. Jesus' 12 disciples, they were all Jews. But then non-Jewish people start to also follow Jesus. What's the word for somebody who's not Jewish? Heard the word?
Gentiles.
Gentiles. You heard that word? That's the way that the Jewish people refer to people who aren't Jewish. They call them Gentiles. So non-Jewish people, Gentiles, also started to follow Jesus. Matter of fact, there's 2 books of the Bible written by a Gentile, by the same Gentile. You know who it was? What 2 books of the Bible were written by a Gentile? Luke and Acts were both written by Luke. And Luke was a Gentile. Luke was not Jewish, but he became a follower of Jesus through Paul. Okay? So the church starts to have Jewish people and Gentile people. And after a while, the Gentiles start to outnumber the Jews. And there's in the Bible, big debates as to, well, if I'm a Gentile and I become a Christian, do I have to become a Jew first? You know, do I have to eat Jewish food and dress like a Jew and do all that stuff? And the church decides, no. No, if you're a Gentile, you don't have to become a Jew first. You can just go straight to being a Christian. So the church grows, and the Jewish people, some Jewish people accept Jesus, some Jewish people don't. And we know Jesus' enemies in the Bible, a lot of them were Jewish people who did not believe he was the Messiah and thought he should die. You know, so there's a lot of opposition to Jesus and to his followers by the Jews in Jerusalem and that kind of stuff. But then, as Christianity grows and grows and grows, there starts to be opposition to Christianity, not just from the Jews, but from who else? What empire is this all happening in? The Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire, which is the biggest, most powerful empire in the world at that time, the empire starts to notice this new thing called Christianity. And at first they don't pay much attention to it because, oh, it's just a bunch of Jews who have a different set of beliefs. But it keeps growing, it keeps growing, it keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And something happens that makes the Roman Empire really upset. Because in the Roman Empire, they believe in all kinds of gods and goddesses. Have you all studied mythology in school yet? You know, like some of the Greek and Roman gods, like what are some of their names? Athena, Zeus, Jupiter, Apollo. Yeah, they didn't, for them those were real. Those were their real gods. And they had temples to those gods. They would go, instead of going to a church or a synagogue, they would go to the temple of Zeus. Or they'd go to the temple of Athena. Or they'd go to the temple of Apollo. And they would worship those gods. And they believed there was a whole bunch of gods. But they also believed that the emperor of Rome was a god. They believed that the emperor of Rome was a god. And because they believed that the emperor of Rome was a god, if you were a loyal citizen of Rome, what did you have to do? Worship the emperor. Matter of fact, here was the law. If you were in Rome, and you're a Roman, you live in the Roman Empire, every person in the Roman Empire, once a year, had to go into a temple, had to pick up some incense, had to throw it in a fire and say, Caesar is God. And after they threw the incense in the fire and said, Caesar is God, they would get a certificate saying, this person has fulfilled their patriotic duty by worshiping the emperor. They are a good citizen. And they get their little certificate. Yes, I'm a good citizen because I worship Caesar as God. What group wouldn't do that?
Christians.
The Christians. Christians would not do that. Christians would not worship Caesar. They would not say Caesar is God. So the Romans started hating Christians. Have you ever heard stories about Christians being like thrown to the lions or killed and all that? Have you ever heard those stories about Christians being killed and persecuted by the Romans? And I always thought, oh, they killed them because they worshipped Jesus. No, they didn't kill them because they worshipped Jesus. They killed them because they wouldn't worship Caesar. It was their refusal to worship Caesar that killed them, that made them be killed. And that's why when they would bring a Christian into the Colosseum, I've actually been to the Colosseum, they bring a Christian into the Colosseum and they turn loose the lions and all that stuff, the lions to eat the Christians, men, women, and children, the crowd would cheer because they're like, those people are disloyal to the empire. Those people are not loyal Romans. They won't worship our emperor. So you say, how can people cheer people being eaten by lions? Well, because to the crowds, Christians were disloyal citizens, unpatriotic citizens. So this hatred and persecution of Christians goes on for 300 years. Okay. For 300 years. So Christians have to meet in secret, meet like underground. You have to be really careful, like who you talk to, and get arrested or killed. Matter of fact, there was even little ways that one Christian could identify another Christian. Like, you might walk up to somebody and it's like, oh, that person, I think they're a Christian, but I'm not totally sure. I'm gonna, in the dirt, I'm gonna make a symbol, I'm gonna do this in the dirt. If the person sees me doing that and they're a Christian, you know what they would do? They'd make, what is that? It's a fish. Because that was a symbol of Christianity. So you could tell the other person was also a Christian. So that goes over 300 years. And so Christianity, to be a Christian meant you might get arrested, you might even get killed. So what do you think that did to Christianity? What would you think that would do to Christianity? What?
It made people like not want to be Christians, and it made the number of Christians go down.
You would actually think that, except the opposite happened. Because people are like, wow, people are willing to die for this Jesus. People are willing to go to jail for this Jesus. People are willing to sacrifice their lives for this Jesus. Who is this Jesus guy that people are willing to risk their lives for? So even though it was dangerous to be a Christian, Christianity kept growing because the people who were following Jesus were so committed that they were willing to even go to jail or die for him. Now other people are like, wow, if people are willing to die for him, he must be something. So yeah, you would think, oh, that would kill Christianity, or that would just wipe out Christianity. Instead, Christianity, even under persecution, it keeps growing. Okay? So Christianity is growing and growing and growing, even under persecution, for about 300 years. Then something kind of amazing happens, because Rome, the emperor, was like a kind of a mega king. Okay? But it wasn't always the son of the emperor becomes the new emperor. Sometimes there would be a challenger, and they'd fight it out, and they'd kill somebody, and the new emperor would like kill the old emperor, and you'd have a new guy in town. So sometimes who's the new emperor is going to be settled on the battlefield, not just by who has a son. So there was turmoil over who's going to be the next emperor, and this guy named Constantine actually becomes the new emperor of Rome. And Constantine, when he's fighting against the other guys who want to be emperor, Constantine says that he looks up in the clouds and sees a cross. And he actually wins the battle. And he starts like thinking, maybe this Christian God is the one who let me win. We all see things in clouds, but he started thinking that. So Constantine becomes emperor, and he legalizes Christianity. He does that in 313 AD. So Christianity becomes legal in the Roman Empire in 313 AD. By the way, we talk about dividing history into BC and AD. What's BC mean?
Before Christ.
Before Christ. What's AD mean?
It's the Latin.
It's Latin. Yeah. How many people know their Latin? Yeah. AD is Anno Domini. Anno means year, like annual. Domini means Lord, like dominate. So AD means year of the Lord. So BC, before Christ, AD, Anno Domini, the year of the Lord. So we are living in the year of the Lord, 2019, which means it's been 2019 years since Jesus was born. Except when they figured that out, they were off by a couple of years. So we think Jesus was probably born in 6 BC, which I know makes you think, how could he be born 6 years before himself? But it just means when they set the calendar, they didn't quite get the years right. But anyway, approximately 2,000 years ago, Jesus was born. Okay, so in 313, Constantine legalizes Christianity. Then he actually becomes a Christian. So that now the emperor of Rome is a Christian. Christianity is not only legal, it's kind of like cool now because the emperor is a Christian. So, hey, if he's a Christian, maybe I will be too. So, here's another kind of counterintuitive thing. Okay, Christianity becoming legal is obviously a good thing on the one hand because they're not killing Christians anymore. Can it also be a bad thing? What could be bad about it suddenly becoming legal and popular? Is there anything bad about it becoming legal and popular? Would some people start to now go to church not because they really admire Jesus, but because it's just now the new popular thing to do? There's no risk anymore. So, yeah, sure, the emperor does it, so I will too. So there's some people now in churches that are just kind of there for the wrong reasons. Now, of course, that would never happen today, would it? Right? There would never be anybody in church for the wrong reason today. And I'm being sarcastic there. Sometimes people are in church for the wrong reason. But, so, Christianity is now legal. Now, in the 300 years, all these churches have stayed alive under persecution. And in every town, you know, every town has a church, or at least every town that has a church, the church has a leader, has a pastor. And in the Bible, they use different words to describe that guy who is the pastor. They sometimes call him the elder, they sometimes call him the bishop, but every church in every town has a leader. And once it becomes legal, and Christianity is kind of now above ground and popular, well, you know, the churches can kind of communicate with each other, be more open. You know, different pastors can talk to other pastors, and they even start having meetings and councils and all that stuff. And there becomes more organization to the church. You know, it becomes more organized now that they're not hiding for their lives. Well, some pastors are more powerful than others because they're the pastor of a larger town. So, if you're the pastor of a bigger church in a bigger town, you kind of have more weight than a pastor of a small church in a small town. What's the biggest town in the Roman Empire? Yeah, it's a trick question. Rome. So, Rome is the biggest city in the Roman Empire. It's the capital of the empire. So, who would be the most powerful pastor in the Roman Empire? The pastor of Rome. Yeah. The bishop, the leader of the Church of Rome. And as the centuries go by, that pastor of that church in Rome starts to kind of be the leader of all the other pastors. He starts to exert more and more control over all the other pastors, and to the point that they start to call him Father, or Papa, or Pope. And that's where the Pope comes from. The Pope is just a word that means father. The Pope is just another word for the Bishop of Rome. The Bishop of Rome is another word for the Bishop of Rome in the early church. They call him the Pope. And for another 700 years, there are no denominations. There's just the church. And over those 700 years, the Bishop of Rome gets more and more and more powerful and more control over all the other churches. Until, you know, today, the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, is a very powerful guy. Well, that lasts until about 1000 AD. So 1,000 years after Jesus and 1,000 years ago, about the midway point between Jesus and us, about 1000 AD, there's another bishop who's super powerful too. He's the Bishop of Constantinople, okay, which is a city that now has a different name in geography test here. It's a city in Turkey. Anybody know what city we're talking about in Turkey? Istanbul. Have you all heard of Istanbul in Turkey? So Istanbul used to be called Constantinople. So the Bishop of Constantinople becomes about as big as Constantinople. The Bishop of Constantinople becomes just about as powerful as the Bishop of Rome. They're both powerful. They both are pastors of really big cities, big towns. Because, well, who's more powerful? And who's got more control? And who's really in charge of Christianity? Well, the Bishop of Rome says, well, I am. But now the Bishop of Constantinople says, no, I am. And this starts a back and forth between these two bishops, the one in Rome, which is in Italy, the one in Constantinople, which is in Turkey. Long story short there, they end up splitting the church. This is the first split of Christianity between Rome in the west and Constantinople in the east. And this is the birth of what we would call denominations. So instead of just the church, now we have to give names to these two different branches of the church. Well, the one that's in Rome, what do you think they call it? Roman Catholic. Okay. This is the Roman Catholic Church. The word Catholic means worldwide. If you've been in Sunday in church, you know I've been talking about this creed called the Apostles' Creed, And next week, the line in the Apostles' Creed, which is something that Christians of all denominations say, it says, we believe in the Holy Spirit, the Holy Catholic Church. And a lot of people are like, Catholic? We're not Catholic, we're Methodist. Well, Catholic with a lowercase c just means universal. Catholic with a capital C refers to this particular denomination, the Roman Catholic Church. That's the name of it, the Roman Catholic Church. We sometimes shorten that and just say Catholic, but it's actually the Roman Catholic. Now, the eastern side, we know what, somebody mentioned this when we were talking about denominations. What do we call the eastern side? The Eastern Orthodox, because it's in the east, and they use this word Orthodox. Okay. Ortho. Where do you see that word in English, ortho?
Orthodox.
In orthodox. So what do you think the word ortho means?
Speak or mouth or teeth.
That'd be a really good guess. That'd be a really good guess.
I like that.
That'd be a really good guess. It wouldn't be right, but it would be a really good guess. What do orthodontists do?
Fix your teeth.
They fix your teeth. Specifically, what do they do to your teeth?
Straighten
They straighten them. That's right. Ortho means straight. Or correct. Or right. Okay. Dox means words or beliefs. So they're saying we're the Eastern, we got the straight beliefs, we got the correct beliefs, we got the right beliefs. That's what Orthodox means. So you got two halves of Christianity now, an Eastern half and a Western half. Now, as we said, there's not a whole lot of Eastern Orthodox churches in Oklahoma. When I was pastoring in Oklahoma City, we were next door to a Greek Orthodox church, and it was the only one in all of Oklahoma City. There's a lot. If you go to Russia, though, the major church in Russia is the Russian Orthodox Church, which is part of this whole Eastern Orthodox Church. If you go to Greece, the Greek Orthodox Church is a part of this branch of Christianity. So this split happens about 1,000 years ago. And about 1,000 years ago is probably one of the darker, not so great times in the history of Christianity, because something happens sort of in the early part of the 11th century, or the late part of the 11th century, something called the Crusades. Anybody ever heard of the Crusades? Okay. Not, you've heard of the Crusades? Okay. It's like, why do we have the Crusades? Well, the reason we have the Crusades is because as Christianity is growing, this other religion is born. This other religion is born because there was this fellow born in the 7th century A.D. named Muhammad. You've all heard of Muhammad? And Muhammad is born in the 7th century A.D. And Muhammad, without going down too far of that field, Muhammad declares himself the last prophet of God. And Muhammad basically says that he is greater than any other prophet, including Jesus. And Muhammad begins to gather followers. And Muhammad is able to unite the entire Arabian Peninsula under his leadership. And he's a military leader. And Muhammad and his followers, in the space of just his lifetime, Muhammad is able to conquer all of the Arabian Peninsula. Which, if you look on a map, the Arabian Peninsula is a pretty big chunk of territory. He unites all these tribes and all these people in Arabia under his new religion. And as already said, the name of that new religion is Islam. The word Islam means basically submission. The word Islam means submission. I remember when 9/11 happened, and a lot of people were, very upset with Muslims, because somebody who follows the religion of Islam is called a Muslim. And a lot of people after 9/11 were upset with Muslims, and President Bush, George W. Bush, got on the air and he said, You know, Islam means peace. Well, President Bush wasn't quite right. Islam means submission. I mean, if everybody submits, you've got peace. I mean, if everybody submits to your will, yeah, you have peace. But the word Islam means submission. And so a Muslim is someone who has submitted to Allah, which is what Muhammad called God. So Islam has come onto the scene, and not only has Islam been born in Arabia, Islam begins to spread. It spreads into North Africa. It takes over Spain. And it keeps going farther and farther and farther into Europe. Well, in the 11th century, Christianity, the Pope in Rome, the fellow who's the leader of the church in the East was a guy named the Patriarch, which means the same thing. But the Eastern Church, the Western Church, they're like, we're about to be overrun by Islam. And so they decide to raise an army to go fight against Muslims. Specifically, they want to go take an army to Israel, which was under the control of Muslims, and take back the Holy Land for Christianity and fight against the Muslims. And this was called a crusade. And so for a couple of hundred years, we've got warfare between Christians and Muslims over the control of the piece of territory that we now would call Israel, the Holy Land. And unfortunately, there's lots of bad stuff happens when you've got that kind of thing happen. Because sometimes along the way, the Christians from the West and the Christians from the East would end up fighting each other instead of fighting the Muslims. And there was lots of just butchering of people, and it was just, there's lots of ugly stuff happening. So that's a bad part of Christian history, that whole crusade thing. But really, that is part of what we often call the Middle Ages. Sometimes we can call it the Dark Ages, where history is kind of grim and dark for hundreds of years. But for hundreds of years, from the year about 1000 AD, when the church splits East and West, for about 500 years, you've got two brands of Christianity, okay, for 500 years. And now we get to the part that I think is really the most interesting. Is in the western part of Europe. So we're talking about England, Germany, France, Italy, etc. All of Western Europe, the Catholic Church is in charge of all Christianity, okay, and the Pope is in charge of all churches. But over hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, there's stuff that had become part of Christianity that really bothered a lot of people. Because think about this, right around, let's say, the year 1500, okay, about 500 years ago. 1500 in Europe, what percentage of people do you think can read and write?
45.
5%.
1%. 1% of people could read and write. So 99% of people were illiterate. So they would go to church, and the priest, who was under the control of the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, would tell them what to believe, and they believed it. Because how could they check to see if it was anything different? They couldn't read or write, so they couldn't read a Bible. And even if they could read or write, there weren't any Bibles around. You know why there weren't any Bibles around?
Nobody can write them.
But yeah, and mainly because there was no such thing as a printing press. Anybody who had a Bible, it was handwritten, hand copied. The only Bibles that existed were Bibles that monks, you may have seen pictures of a monk on a stool with a quill, a feather, and he's got an inkwell, he's hunched over a table, and he's copying a Bible onto a scroll, one word at a time. It would take a monk 1 year, if he was a really good monk, it would take a monk 1 year to make a copy of the Bible. So, the only people who had Bibles, or you'd be like one per church, but the only person who could read it was usually the priest. He was usually the only one who could read and write. And extremely rich people who could afford one, because a handwritten book that took a year to write, you'd have to be super rich to afford. So if the priest said, you know, God has green shoes, what could the people do about it? They go, oh, okay, I guess he does. I mean, there was no way for them to not know what they were being told was true. I mean, anything the priest said, the people just had to go, okay, because they didn't own a Bible, they didn't know how to read and write, there was no way to check anything. Well, there were two things happened at the beginning of the 1500s that changed history. One was the invention of the printing press. And I know in our culture of iPhones and everything else, you probably don't even think about how much that changed the world. But think about a world where there are no books. I mean, much less there's no, electronics or TV. I mean, a world where there are no books and nobody can read them if they are having. The ignorance there. A world without books. A world without reading. Suddenly, these guys named Gutenberg invent a way to mass produce books. And once you have the ability to mass produce books, people can begin to learn to read and write. And knowledge now starts to actually spread. So this is it. I remember there was a book that came out in the year 2000. And the name of this book was The 1,000 Most Significant Events of the Last 1,000 Years. It was a book that says, here's the 1,000 most important things that happened between 1000 AD and 2000 AD. And number one was the printing press. Number one. The most important thing that happened in the history of the world in the last 1,000 years is the invention of the printing press. So suddenly people can learn to read and write. Well, that happens. And what also happens is there's this little guy, this monk, he's not that little, but there's this monk, and this Catholic monk. His name is Martin Luther. Now, most of you have probably heard more about Martin Luther King than you have about Martin Luther. Martin Luther King Jr. was named after Martin Luther. Martin Luther King Jr., that we had a holiday for a couple of weeks ago, is an African-American preacher who was killed in the 1960s. Martin Luther is a Catholic monk who lived in the 1500s, and Martin Luther King Jr. was named after Martin Luther. So Martin Luther is a Catholic priest and a monk. The way he became a monk and a priest was he didn't want to be one. His dad wanted to be a lawyer. He was very smart. But one day Martin Luther is riding around on his horse, and he's in the middle of a lightning storm, and he's scared to death. And in the middle of the lightning storm, he cries out to one of the saints, to Saint Anne, and says, Saint Anne, save me and I shall become a priest. Well, he didn't die from the lightning storm, so he felt, okay, I got to become a priest now. So instead of going to law school, he became a priest. But he's a brilliant guy. Learns all these different languages. Speaks Hebrew, Greek, Latin, German. He's a brilliant, brilliant guy. So the job they give him as a priest is to be a college professor, because he's so smart. So his job is to lecture about the Bible. So he can read Hebrew, he can read Greek, he can read Latin, he can do all this stuff. He's super smart. So he's studying to give these lectures on the Bible. And as he reads more of the Bible, he reads the Bible, he reads the Bible, and he's like, wait a minute. There's a lot of stuff we're doing in the church that doesn't match up with the Bible. There's all kinds of stuff we're doing that's not in the Bible. And some of the stuff that he's like, I don't know why we're doing this because it's not in the Bible. For example, praying to saints. In the Catholic Church, they would pray to saints. They pray to different saints for different reasons. This is the patron saint of this, or this is the patron saint of that. If you're going to travel, pray to Saint Christopher. Saint Nicholas is the patron saint of children. and pawn shops too. All these different saints, and especially people would pray to Mary. They pray to Mary. And Martin Luther's looking through the Bible. He's like, there's nothing in here about praying to saints or praying to Mary. He's like, why are we doing that? There's other stuff that Martin Luther says, none of this is in the Bible. And you might say, well, why were they doing it? Well, remember, it's 1,500 years since Jesus. There's lots of periods of ignorance, and lots of things get taught that just are kind of by tradition, or somebody thinks, oh, this is a good idea, and these doctrines and beliefs kind of get added on to Christianity almost like barnacles on a ship. They just kind of attach themselves. But Luther starts looking at some of the doctrines of the Catholic Church and saying, these are not biblical. And here's the one that bugged him the most. The one that really drove Martin Luther crazy. Okay, and this one is kind of weird and kind of complicated, but it's the one that Martin Luther had the most trouble with. Okay, here's what the Catholic Church had come to believe. They came to believe that there was this place called purgatory. Anybody know? No, a couple. I know you know about this because you go to a Catholic school. Have you ever heard of this idea of purgatory? I'm not talking about a skiing place. Isn't there a purgatory in New Mexico? Yeah. A doctrine called purgatory. And here's what the Catholic Church taught. They taught that there's not just heaven and hell. They taught that there's this other place called purgatory. And they taught that if you are like a saint, like a super Christian, when you die, you go to heaven. But if you're just like a regular Christian, you don't go to heaven when you die. You go to purgatory, is what they taught. And purgatory was a place, what's the first part of the word purgatory? Purge. Yeah. Isn't there a movie? Isn't there a movie called The Purge? And it's exactly what you think. They taught that if you are not a saint, if you're just kind of a regular Christian, when you die, you're not perfect. You've got still sin in your life. So they taught that if you are just a normal Christian, when you die, you would go to purgatory, and there you would be purged of all your impurities and all your sins. And they taught that then after a few hundred years, you would get to go to heaven. So after a few hundred years of very unpleasant purging, you would get to go to heaven. So most people didn't expect to go to heaven when they died. They thought they'd go to purgatory. And eventually, after a few hundred years there, then they'd get to go to heaven. Well, the Catholic Church also taught that there was some like super saints, okay, like Mary. Because in the Catholic Church, Mary is considered sinless. Okay. The Catholic Church thought that Mary was so perfect and so good that she had like extra credit going for her. Okay, like not only could she go straight to heaven, she had like, she didn't just have 100, she had 500. She had all this extra credit. Now they don't usually use that language, but I'm simplifying it for you guys, okay? So there's like this extra, what they call the treasury of merit. Treasury of merit. And this is like from saints who were so good that they like built up all this extra credit goodness. And they taught, if I'm in purgatory and I've got to be there 300 years before I can go to heaven, I can get some of this extra credit over here and shorten my time in purgatory. Well, how do I get this extra credit? Who's in charge of this extra credit? Guess who? The Pope. The Pope is in charge of it. The Pope can say, all right, 50 years off your time, 100 years off your time, 200 years off your time. But the Pope can hand out this merit, and it's called an indulgence. And you have to indulge me. The Pope can hand out this extra credit. Well, how do you get this indulgence? Well, in the 1500s, here's what would happen. They were trying, in the 1500s, they were trying to raise money to build St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. I have been inside St. Peter's Basilica. It's in the Vatican. It's an incredibly magnificent church. It's one of the most magnificent churches, maybe the most magnificent church in the world. They were trying to raise money to build St. Peter's Basilica in the 1500s. They needed a lot of money. So here's what they did. They sent out guys all throughout Western Europe to sell indulgences. They said, you give this much of a donation, the Pope will take 100 years off your time in purgatory. They started selling time out of purgatory. And not only could you buy it for yourself, you could buy it for your dead relatives. Like, hey, my mother was not that great. She's probably really suffering in purgatory. I can buy an indulgence and cut her sentence down by 100 years for a good donation. So, the Catholic Church is raising tons of money selling papal indulgences. Selling people this way to get out of purgatory and get into heaven. So this is happening all over Western Europe. All I have to say, when Martin Luther is reading the Bible, and he realizes what's happening, that the church is selling indulgences, he's like, there's no such thing as purgatory. He's like, nowhere in the Bible is there anything about purgatory. Purgatory doesn't exist. There is no purgatory. And then he says, and if there were, you sure couldn't buy your way out of it. I mean, he basically says the whole system is non-biblical. The saints, Mary, Mary's treasury of merit, indulgences, the authority of the Pope over every other Christian and every other pastor, the whole thing, Luther says, the whole thing is non-biblical. The whole thing is wrong. Luther says, the only thing, you don't talk to a saint or to Mary, you talk directly to Jesus. You're not saved by buying your way out of anything. You're saved by putting your faith in Christ. We're saved only by faith. So Luther writes up everything that's wrong with the Catholic Church. Okay? He comes up with 95 things that are wrong with the Catholic Church. And he takes this list of 95 things that are non-biblical about the Catholic Church. And he's in a town in Germany called Wittenberg. It's actually spelled with a W, but it's pronounced with like a V. He goes to a church in Wittenberg, Germany. Okay? And he goes to the church door of Wittenberg, Germany with his 95 things. And on October 31, 1517, okay, on Halloween, October 31, 1517, he nails these to the church door of the church in Wittenberg. This is 95 things where the Catholic Church is not in agreement with the Bible. And he basically says to the leaders of the Catholic Church, we need to talk about this. We need to change all this. We need to get ourselves in accordance with the Bible. So what do you think Pope and all those other people thought about that?
Thank you, guys.
Huh? What do you think they thought about that?
You're going to be a Christian for a long time?
Huh? Yeah. They said, who do you think you are? You little peon monk. You little nobody in Germany. Who do you think you are to tell us what's right and wrong? Who do you think you are? And they said, take it all back. Take it all back. Say, I was wrong. Take it all back. But Martin Luther was as stubborn as a mule. Martin Luther said, unless you can show me from the Bible where I'm wrong, I ain't taking it back. And this started a movement. And what allowed the movement to go beyond Germany was what? What invention? The printing press. The printing press, because guess what Martin Luther did? He printed all this stuff up. started getting distributed all over Germany. And then it started getting distributed outside of Germany to Switzerland and France and Italy and all these other places. And suddenly, the Catholic Church had a big problem on their hands. Because Martin Luther was saying, we need to reform the church. We need to reform the church. And he was protesting against all these things that were wrong. So, the people who followed Martin Luther became known as Protestants. And this whole movement became called the Reformation. The Protestant Reformation. It started in 1570. And this changed Christianity, at least in the western part of Christianity, Europe and eventually America. And this changed Christianity into these two groups, these two halves. On the one side, Roman Catholic. On the other side, Protestant. And Protestant includes Methodist and Baptist and Lutheran and Presbyterian and Church of Christ and on and on and on, and Life Church and on and on and on and on and on. We are all Protestants. Okay. So the division in Christianity is now, at least in, I say, the Western realms, between Roman Catholics and Protestants. Now I need to stop here and say, the Catholic Church has reformed some of the stuff from 500 years ago. Okay? The Catholic Church doesn't still have salesmen out there selling indulgences, you know. But they do still teach that there is such a thing as a papal indulgence, and they still do teach about purgatory. They haven't changed their doctrine about those things. They don't do it as crudely and as crassly as they were doing it in the 1500s. But the Catholic Church does still have all these differences in how they teach and how we teach. Now, we have a lot in common with our Catholic friends. Matter of fact, I've been talking in church about the Apostles' Creed. They believe everything we believe in the Apostles' Creed. And there's a lot of stuff we agree on. But there's stuff we disagree on. And some of those things would be like the role of Mary. We don't pray, in the Protestants, we don't pray to Mary. The Catholic Church teaches that Mary never died. They teach that Mary was taken directly into heaven and never died. They also teach that Mary was born sinless, a doctrine they call the Immaculate Conception. So they teach a whole lot of different things about Mary. They preach about saints. They talk about that the Pope has this authority. And their basis for saying the Pope has this authority is kind of an after-the-fact thing. After the fact, they begin to say, well, Peter was the first pope. They say Peter was the first pope, and Jesus gave Peter this authority when he said, blessed are you, Peter, on this rock I'll build my church. And he says that to Peter. They said he gave Peter this authority, and that Peter was the first bishop of Rome, and that everyone who has been the bishop of Rome since Peter has that same authority. That's their doctrine for why the Pope has this authority. Now, again, if you look in the Bible, does it ever say Peter went to Rome? No. Nowhere in the Bible does it say anything about Peter ever going to Rome, much less becoming the bishop of Rome. Is it conceivable that Peter went to Rome? I mean, it's conceivable that he did, but we have no historical evidence that Peter ever went to Rome. But the Catholic Church teaches that Peter was the first pope, and that every bishop of Rome since him has that authority. So we are Protestants. Now, in the last 10 minutes here, let me say, how do you get from Martin Luther to us? Okay? So, all these Protestant churches start. What do you think the followers of Martin Luther called themselves? Lutherans. Yeah, that one's easy. Now, Protestantism spreads all over Europe. You got some Catholic areas, some Protestant areas. England was Catholic until the 1500s. The King of England, Henry VIII, you've heard of him maybe, right? Henry VIII. Henry was a good Catholic. But he had a problem. He had too many wives. Actually had 6 wives, one after the other. Henry VIII was married to the Princess of Spain, Catherine of Aragon. And she couldn't produce a male heir for him. Plus he had a mistress. So he wanted to divorce his wife and marry his mistress. He's the King of England. So what did he have to do to get a divorce from his queen? Whose permission did he need? The Pope's permission. He needed the Pope's permission to divorce his wife. The Pope wouldn't give him permission. Because the Pope didn't want to make Spain mad. Because remember, he's married to the Princess of Spain. And the Pope didn't want to make Spain mad by allowing Henry to divorce the Princess of Spain. So the Pope said no. So what did Henry do? He's like, we'll become Protestants. We'll just become Protestants. And then I can divorce my wife and marry my mistress. So Henry VIII decided, okay, England is now Protestant. And I'm going to be the head of the church. The King of England will also be the head of the Church of England. So that's where the Church of England comes from. This happens also in the 1500s, and they give, the name of it is the Church of England. If you go to England, they talk about the C of E, the Church of England. Or they also call it, you know the other name for the Church of England? The Anglican. The Anglican. And in this country, the Church of England in this country is called the Episcopal Church. But, Church of England. Now, in the Church of England, I'm going to flash forward a couple of hundred years. In the Church of England, there was a guy born in 1703, and his dad was a priest in the Church of England. This guy that was born in 1703, his name was John, what? Wesley. Yeah. 1703, this guy named John Wesley is born. His dad is a priest in the Church of England. Because the Church of England kept a lot of the form of the Catholic Church. They changed who's in charge of it, but if you go to an Episcopal church, it'll kind of feel a lot like a Catholic church. You know, there's some differences, but it feels a little Catholic when you go to an Episcopal church. So, John Wesley is born in a city called Epworth, England. His dad is the priest or the pastor of Epworth, England. John Wesley, he's one of 19 kids. His mom has 19 children. He's a sharp guy. He decides to become a priest like his dad in the Church of England. He goes to Oxford University, real smart guy. He becomes a priest in the Church of England and starts doing all the stuff you're supposed to do. But, he's not really satisfied. And he decides he's going to go and be a missionary to America, to the colonies. Okay? Comes to Georgia. Decides he's going to convert the American Indian to Christianity. He's a failure, doesn't convert a single Indian. Goes back to England, is depressed. His whole spiritual life is kind of a bummer. What? So he goes to, he's real depressed. He's like, I don't know. He's like, I don't even know if I'm a Christian anymore. He's super depressed. He gets dragged to a Bible study, and it's on this place called Aldersgate Street in London. And at the Bible study, they're reading, guess what? They're reading the writings of Martin Luther. Things go full circle. Martin Luther's commentary on the book of Romans. And Luther is highlighting what Paul says in Romans about we're saved by faith, not by works. We're saved by grace. We're not saved by our own works. We're saved by the blood of Jesus. And for some reason, Wesley read that passage 100 times. But that night, it just hit him somehow. That he wasn't going to be saved by his deeds or his works. He was going to be only saved by the grace of God, by faith. And he said his heart felt like his heart was on fire. And he's like, suddenly he's on fire for Christ. And his preaching changed, from kind of boring to super excited. And they call that enthusiasm, which in the Church of England was a no-no. They didn't like anybody to have enthusiasm. They wanted everybody to be boring. Okay? The preacher was supposed to stand behind the pulpit and read the sermon and be nice and proper and boring. Wesley started getting all agitated and excited and stuff. And so they wouldn't let him in the church because he's too excitable. He's got too much enthusiasm. And that sounds weird. He's got too much enthusiasm. And he's got a friend who says, you know what, in the Church of England, it's so dull and it's so boring, and the only people who show up are the rich people, and the poor people don't feel welcome, and we got a whole country full of people who don't know Jesus. He says, I'm going to start preaching just to poor people outside, street preaching, field preaching. And he says, John, you need to do it too. And Wesley's like, that doesn't sound very proper to me. And he's like, come on, you know you need to do this. So he convinces Wesley to start preaching to the poor people, just like Wesley went to the coal mines and stood on a stump as the workers are coming out of the coal mines and started preaching to them about Jesus. And a crowd of like 1,000 coal miners are listening to him preach on a stump. And they're like covered with coal dust. And they're like crying, little lines in their faces in the coal dust as they hear about Jesus. And thousands of people start becoming Christians with Wesley like preaching outdoors and preaching to the poor people. And Wesley was really smart because he not only knew he had to just preach, he had to get them organized into like small groups. And they couldn't just like give their life to Jesus and like, well, I'll see you later. So he's like, you need to organize yourself into these like Bible study small groups. That's what they do. They start organizing all these people into Bible study small groups. And you know what they call these small groups? They call them Methodist societies, because they were so methodical. They were, they were very like, we got a plan, we got to do this, 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 this. So they're Methodist societies. Now there's still, it's like, this is meant to be a revival in the Church of England. Wesley wasn't trying to start a church. He was just trying to revive the Church of England and bring it to the people. He never intended to start his own church. He just wanted to bring life. And it started to sweep all through England. And he's like, you know what? We got to spread this to the colonies, over in America. Because this is before the American Revolution. This is in the early to mid 1700s. So they send Methodist people to America to start this whole movement over here, still within the Church of England. And the main guy they send is a guy named Francis Asbury. You may have heard that name. They've named a bunch of churches after him. I think there's one in Tulsa named after him.
Small.
A little small church in Tulsa named after Francis Asbury. So they send this guy, Francis Asbury, to America to start this whole Methodist thing here. Again, a movement inside the Church of England. But then, this is in the 1770s. 1770s. What happens in the colonies in the 1770s?
America starts winning.
Yeah, we have this whole revolution, this American Revolution over here. And when the American Revolution happens over here, how popular do you think the Church of England is? Yeah, not very. Not very. And all the Church of England ministers basically leave the colonies. But Asbury stays. And so instead of becoming now a movement within the Church of England, they decide, we're going to start a whole new church. And they start what's called the Methodist Church. That's where the Methodist Church comes from. The Methodist Church is actually born in America. The Methodist movement starts in England, but it becomes its own church in America. And it's officially like born, in 1784. Is the actual official beginning of the Methodist Church. So that means our church, the Methodist Church, was born in 1784. You do the math, 16, we're 234 years old. That's the proper. Anyway. So the church is born, more or less, 1784. And it was first called the Methodist Episcopal Church. The word Episcopal just means we have bishops, and we do. We have bishops. Not every denomination has bishops. Then, in 1968, when I was 8 years old, the Methodist Church, the Methodist Episcopal Church, actually merged with a church called the Evangelical United Brethren. And they changed the name to the United Methodist Church. So the name we have now, the United Methodist Church, was because we merged with this other church that had the word United in their name. So the United Methodist Church, the official name of our denomination, we changed the name in 1968. So, and the Methodist Church, here's how the Methodist Church was able to grow. Because, you know, other churches was like, well, we need to build a building, and then once we get a building built, we can find a minister, and then we can start having church. The Methodist Church didn't wait for there to be a building. They had these guys on horseback called circuit riders. And they would just go to a new town and just start a church. I mean, they didn't have a building or anything. They would just start a Methodist church, and they would preach, and they'd go, all right, you guys are going to meet every Sunday in a small group, and I'll be through once a month to serve communion, and good luck, and I'm going to go to the next town and start another one. And these guys on horseback just would go from town to town to town, starting these little Methodist small groups that would grow and grow and grow, and then maybe eventually they'd have a building, or maybe eventually, but they just kept planting churches. You know, the guy would ride his horse to the next town, start a church, go to the next town, start another one. And so the Methodist Church just kept starting churches as America moved west. The Methodist Church just kept moving west with it. And so at one time there were more Methodist churches than there were post offices in this country. Because they didn't wait for there to be a building. You know, they just kept planting churches and going on to the next town. And of course our church here, First Methodist Broken Arrow, was started in 1903. So our church is 116 years old. You know, and that's because, you know how this church got, like, when they founded Broken Arrow, when Broken Arrow was started as a town, the landowners said, we're going to give one plot of land for a church. We don't know what denomination. And they said, whichever church has the most people show up, it'll be that kind of church. The Methodists had more people show up than any other group, so we got the land. this land. So our church was the first church in Broken Arrow. We are the oldest church in the city of Broken Arrow. 2 or 3 years later, a bunch of Baptists went, well, we got to start our own church too. So they started the First Baptist. But they're the second oldest church in town. But our church is the oldest church in Broken Arrow, the first church that was planted in the city of Broken Arrow back in 1903, before we were a state, before Oklahoma was even a state. All right, we got like 10 minutes for questions. I know it's a lot to try to absorb, because that's 2,000 years, basically.